All right, continuing from where we left off last time. Last time I talked about implementing the item service in a similar way to how we did the list service, which I've done. I implemented all these methods. I also implemented the tests for it, so everything looks good. I did the Maven clean install, all of my tests passed and everything. I did get a bunch of logging output from the Hikari data source as well as Flyway's migration. So let's go ahead and fix that. We'll come over here to our logback test. We'll update Flyway to Warn and Zaxxer to Warn. We're not actually seeing any SQLite output. Everything is info, so just setting it to Warn should disable all that. We'll rerun everything here. In the meantime, we'll close these out. Shrink this down. Shrink that down. Shrink that down. Okay. All right, everything looks good here. I wasn't watching for the DB output, but I see now. Here's the DB output. No logging, so everything looks good. Let's go ahead and see what we changed. So we added a bunch of DB code, makes sense. We updated some of our filters when we moved. We relocated this Rapid API principal and the subscription classes into a different package, which resulted in these updates kind of happening automatically. All right, there we go. We're all committed. So the next step I'd like to do is let's get this database code into our REST API so that we can get rid of this hello resource and actually add some to-do list resources. So what we're going to need to do, we're actually going to need to modify our server. And I'll explain why in a second. So in our API application here, it's finally time to set up some dependency injection. We're going to need to dependency inject some of our database classes, like our service factory, right? We've got default service factory, which implements service factory. So we need to make this service factory available to our REST endpoints, and we're going to do that using dependency injection here. So what I'd like to do is pass in our configuration info that we create from our server into our API application so that we can use it in here, and then we can create our database connection things inside here, create a default service factory, and add it to our binder here so that we can inject it. So in order to pass this config information into our API application, we need type-safe config in here. Let's see, dependency com.typesafe. There we go, there's our type-safe config. We also need our database code. All right, let's get this updated. Now we're gonna have to refactor our server a little bit. So right now, we're using these two lines to add our API application to our server as a servlet. So we're doing that by just specifying this JAX-RS application and telling it the name of our application. Instead, we really want to just create an instance of our application so that we can pass in, we have this config object here and down here that we load from GitHub, depending on what mode we're in. So what we need to do is create an application in here with that configuration instead of just telling our servlet, our server context handler to create that servlet for us. So we basically want to create it ourselves. So we can create a new servlet holder. Servlet holder has a few methods in it, including one that takes a servlet. And our servlet is right here, servlet container. So let's create a new one of those. Our servlet container can take a parameter of a resource config. Our API application is a resource config. Oops, I just killed it. Let me open it again. So we can say new API application, and we can pass in this config that we have up here as a parameter into this method. So once we have a API servlet holder, we can pass that in here. All right, so this is effectively the same thing as what we did have, just very slightly different in that we're creating the classes ourselves rather than letting Jetty create them for us. So we do have this parameter problem here. That's because we need an import for this config. All right, and that resolves that problem, and everything else looks good. So we do have these related problems. Okay, because we do have our hello resource integration test is creating a new API application, so we do need to pass in some configuration here as well. So we can do a config loader. I think it's config loader. Let me come back and look over here. Oh, config factory, not config loader. Config factory, and we want to basically come up with some test configurations that we can pass in here. So we can either load it from a string, we can parse it from a file, parse it from a map. Let's do or properties object. So there's multiple ways we can get it in. Let's do properties. Something like that. Properties. All right, now in here we can insert the necessary properties that we want. For example, set property, and then we've got our config keys. Now, since config key is up here in server, and this code here is in REST, we don't actually have access to config key. So what that means is we're going to need to shuffle some stuff around again. So let's move our config information up here into model. Let's create a new config package. Let's take all three of these and drag them up here. We also, let's close them because we don't need them open. So we do have some tests down here for config. Let's create a new config class here and move these up here. All right, so that looks good. That looks good. So now we should be able to say config key dot, and then set whatever configurations we want. Now in this case, our server doesn't actually have any security things, so let's delete that line for now, and we'll add it. We'll add more properties here in a minute. So that fixes that problem. Let's we don't actually need this package anymore. Let's delete that. We don't need this package either. I'm not going to delete this whole package here because we may end up adding some unit tests for our server in there before long. I might do that offline. Okay, so now our API application has config. We need to create our database inside here, or I should say our service factory. So we'll start with this, and we'll do return new default service factory. We'll need a data source, and so up here is where we'll define that data source. Now, if I look up here, so we have our data source here. Now this data source doesn't really do any configuration of the data source, meaning it doesn't do flyway, migrations, or anything like that. We are doing flyway migrations manually in our data source extension, which also creates a service factory. So really what we should do is move this flyway configurer stuff into our default service factory so that it can do the database migration things in one place, and that way I don't have to have this flyway stuff here as well as here in our API application. So let's go ahead and cut that. Let's come over here and we'll put it right here. So the first thing we do before creating any services is we do database initialization. That means over here we don't need this before all, which means we don't need this before all callback. Now, something I probably shouldn't do is recreate this service factory every single time. I can put it up here, and I can do the creation here, like that, and then we don't need that line at all. So now we can do our service factory truncation things without having to recreate this default service factory every single time. That seems to make sense to me. All right, so from in here, now when this default service factory is created, we'll get that same flyway database initialization, and flyway will run this script for us and initialize our database tables. So now from in here, we need to redo our Hikari config stuff, which we are also doing up here. So let me just copy paste this over here into our application. Now I'll call this db config, just so we don't have name conflicts. Then I'll do that and that. All right, so this information here we should get from our config object. Now our config object loads everything from the appropriate GitHub system configuration. So we need to put our database configuration properties in here. Let's close that. We're done with this as well. And we're done with this one. So we basically just need this information here. So we'll do a db.driver. We'll do a db.url, username, and password. So this will be, I think this JDBC class was org.sqlite.jdbc, so we'll do that. I'll copy paste this. We're not actually using these usernames and passwords, so I'll leave those blank. And I forgot my equal sign there. All right, so this looks pretty good. Let me copy paste these for our production server. Now in production, we're not actually going to use an in-memory SQLite database. Let's look. Let's Google this out. Create a new database. Or maybe I should do SQLite JDBC URL. Okay, so here's some examples. So we basically want something like this. where we specify the path to the file. And in production, we'll use something like, oh, I don't know, probably in the home directory that we're going to create. So probably var tutorial API data, something like that. And we'll leave these username and passwords blank as well. I don't think we need those for SQLite at all. All right, so now let's, well, I guess we'll do git add everything at the end. So in order to fetch these out, we need to update config key. So we need db, let's see, driver. All right, so we need those. Now we can come over here and say config.getString, and then config key driver get key. Oh, that's actually the wrong place. We'll put that there. Change driver to URL. Change that with the username. And that with the password. Okay, that looks pretty good. That will give us a new service factory. Up here, we can create service factory. And then we can do bind service factory to service factory.class. So now, in theory, if I shrink these down and come into REST, hello resource, I should be able to do something like that. All right, so now we should get our service factory initialized. If I run our tutorial API server, and we get a big exception. Let's come up to the top. Okay, no configuration setting found. That's because we didn't actually push that information up to GitHub. Let's see if we can actually build this. We're not using this service factory, so PMD might complain about that, although we are initializing it. Okay, unused private field, logger, an API application, and it is complaining about service factory as well. I think in hello resource. So let's do service factory, get our to-do list. Actually, let's return okay, so I need to pass in a principal here. So we can retrieve a security context, and we should be able to wrap Rapid API security context. This is saying principal is required, or found a principal but required Rapid API. So get user principal actually returns a principal. So I need to do that. All right, let's actually log that as well. All right, so let me see if this builds. All right, we are actually getting those same errors in our integration tests, which makes sense. I never did add, where's hello resource test down in here? I never did set any properties in here. So let's do properties.setProperty config key dot driver URL. Actually, we need .get key in here as well. Username, password, our URL. I've already forgotten. Let's bring up our properties file. Copy both of those. Actually, for this one, we can use let's import that if my fingers would work. All right, let's do that. Let's run this build one more time. All right, here's our REST tests. Okay. Everything, or almost everything. Test valid headers. All right, this has to do with the security stuff that we stuck in here. So let's not push too far all at once. Let's just return hello again here. And all right, last build, and then everything will work and we'll commit it all up. Fingers crossed. Okay, now I'm back to I'm back to PND problems with service factories that we're not actually using. So let's do that. We've still got our logging from this parameter. All right. Instead of thinking, trial and error, it's a little bit slower, but a little bit easier. And now we're doing dependency things. So unused, declared dependencies in REST, or excuse me, used but undeclared, which makes sense. We are defining those. So let's come over here. Let's get SQLite JDBC down here in org. Zeros at the end. All right, there's that one. We also need Jakarta inject. That's from that inject annotation, which I don't have in the top level POM either. And then I need Hikari. Let me close some of these out. Open the top level POM. Alright, in the top level POM, we need a Jakarta inject version 2.0.0. Here's Jakarta annotations. We'll put it right in here. And we'll include it in here. And used undeclared. Okay, so we are using our model in the server. I forget where. Oh, config key, we moved to model. That makes sense. Okay, so in the server, we're using model. And then we are no longer using Jupyter since we moved our unit tests as well. All right, dependency plugin doing its job, keeping this straight on what dependencies we're using. It's easy to overlook things like that. All right, there we go, fresh build. We've got a bunch of logging here from our hello resource. We'll fix that real quick. Here, we want com.zaxer at warm, and we want org.flywaydb, something like that. So now let me just build just the rest to verify that that fixed our logging problems. Oh yeah, that's right, I forgot. I've got this reactor module convergence. Let's actually get rid of this. Let's start building one module at a time. I thought it was reactor. Enforcer plugin. Oh, it's lowercase r. Okay. All right. Logging's looking good. All right. Get status. All right, so we shuffled our configuration around. We updated our API application to accept configuration in, and so it looks good. And let's push it. All right, so that's it for this one. We didn't actually run our server here to verify that our resource is getting this configuration. We'll do that next time. And then we'll jump into actually retrieving the configuration info from GitHub and creating our DB stuff on the fly and returning our to-do list from this resource. So we'll start that next time. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good YouTube stuff. And I'll see you for the next one.